welcome to episode 29 of the Crime Bistro podcast, our first episode in 2024, and also the first episode that is going to be coming at you live from Arizona. So, new house, new state, lots of big things happening around here. But, as always, this show gazes into the thrillingly twisted world of true crime, examining real cases while we share in a passion for crime and coffee alike. So for this episode, I'm enjoying a hazelnut cold brew, so grab yourself a fresh brew, and let's get into the unsolved 1982 Chicago Tylenol murders. In 1982, terror struck the Chicago area when 7 people were killed by Tylenol capsules that had been laced with potassium cyanide, and those deaths have remained unsolved to this day. Psychologists called this killer so strange that their normal guidelines just don't work. A disturbing description that is furthered by the fact that no motive for this crime has ever been revealed. This case propelled so much fear at the time that it was only the beginning of a string of copycat incidents, as well as the catalyst for major changes in the food and drug industries, many of which are measures that we now interact with on a daily basis. There are a number of theories, but no answer has ever come to light, and unfortunately for those most closely affected by a personal loss, answers seem as if they may still be far in the future, though the investigation is still open. From the beginning, there was no motive, no real suspect, and it spurred one of the largest investigations in the history of the city of Chicago. So before we really get into this case, we're going to start with a little bit of an introduction. Tylenol is the most common over-the-counter pain medicine in the United States, also known as acetaminophen. It is manufactured by McNeil Consumer Products, which falls under the parent company Johnson & Johnson, which is going to be a major player in the case that we're discussing today. Until September of 1982, Tylenol sales were through the roof, and the product had captured 35% of the over-the-counter pain medicine market share, and it was only predicted to grow as 1983 was growing closer. At the time, there wasn't such a variety in over-the-counter medication as we have today, so people took Tylenol for a variety of different symptoms. That is, until the morning of September 29th, when everything would change for the company and for 7 individuals who fell victim to a faceless crime. On the morning of September 29th, 1982, in Elk Grove Village, which is a suburb of Chicago, the parents of 12-year-old Mary Kellerman gave her an extra-strength Tylenol when she woke during the night suffering from cold symptoms. She had a fever, a headache, and a sore throat. She was going to be allowed to stay home from school that day to recover, however, she never got that chance, and by around 7 a.m., Mary had passed away after collapsing suddenly. At first, absolutely no one could figure out what had happened to the young girl. The next victims in this case were several members of the Janus family. So first, let's talk about a little bit of background on Adam and Teresa Janus. Adam had moved from Poland to Chicago about 2 decades before this, and on a trip back to Poland he had met Teresa. They fell in love, so she moved back with him to Chicago, and they bought a house together on Mitchell Avenue. They got married, and they had 2 kids, and were fully living out the American dream. Their house was simple, 3 bedrooms, nothing lavish, but they were very happy. Notably, their home on Mitchell Avenue was only about 10 miles away from the house where Mary Kellerman had lived with her parents. On Wednesday, the 29th of September, Adam had the day off from the post office, and he had a pretty normal day running some errands around the city. He wasn't feeling great, but he did pick up his 4-year-old daughter from preschool, and on the way home, he stopped at the grocery store to get flowers for Teresa, some steaks for dinner, and a bottle of Tylenol. Adam took 2 of these extra-strength Tylenol capsules and started to feel bad immediately. He was home at this point, so he came out of the bathroom, appearing to be clutching his chest. Teresa immediately called his brother Joe after they had gotten to the hospital to give him the news. At the time, the hospital determined that his cause of death was a massive heart attack at 3:15 p.m. Keep in mind, he was only 27 years old. The paramedics who responded said they noticed a lot of weird things about Adam's case, not only the fact that he was 27 and in apparent great shape. They saw that his eyes were fixed, dilated, and non-responsive even though he was still alive. He was just unconscious. They also noted that his breathing was incredibly shallow. Like Mary, he had fallen unconscious after taking the Tylenol. After Adam's death, the family, including 2 of Adam's brothers, Joe and Stanley, who was 25, and Stanley's wife, Terry, went back to the house thinking that they would start making funeral preparations. Stanley and Terry had just gotten married, and they had actually just returned to their honeymoon, This had happened so soon afterwards that they hadn't even gotten the proofs of their wedding photos back yet. Not feeling well, which is totally understandable under the circumstances, Stanley was experiencing a headache on top of the fact that he already had a bad back, so he went into the bathroom and he took one of the pills of Tylenol that were still stored there. He immediately started to experience the same symptoms that Adam had. He collapsed on the floor, and his brother Joe reported that he was foaming at the mouth and his eyes were turning white. Stanley's wife Terry, who was only 20, had also taken 2 of these extra-strength Tylenol capsules. The family immediately called 911, and ironically the same dispatch team that had responded to the first call for Adam arrived at the home once again as quickly as they could. This crew later described the scene as absolute chaos, saying that there were people outside the home and screaming coming from within. As Terry was screaming for her husband, all of a sudden she also collapsed, seemingly out of nowhere, and when paramedics shone a light in her eyes, they were fixed and dilated, just like Adam's had been. After that, the paramedics could only be sure of one thing. In all likelihood, there was no way that all of these instances were heart attacks. I mean, seriously, 3 in the same family within a few hours? I don't think so. Horrifically, both Stanley and his wife were rushed to the hospital that same day, with Stanley dying nearly immediately and Teresa in serious condition. Dr. Thomas Kim, the chief of critical care, was also the one who had pronounced Adam dead earlier that day and given the news to his family, actually met the family outside as he was on his way home from work for the day, and said that he just could not believe what was happening. It was him that treated Stanley and Teresa, and he cordoned off other members of the family in a meeting room as a precaution. At this point, they had no way of knowing if this was something contagious, and more than a dozen people were put into quarantine in this way, including Chuck Kramer, who was the fire chief who had responded to both of the 911 calls from the family. As they were sitting in quarantine, Chuck Kramer called a nurse named Helen, who came to the hospital to try and investigate what had been causing healthy young people to just collapse so suddenly. She interviewed Teresa, who was Adam's wife, with Joe, her brother-in-law, acting as a translator because she didn't speak too much English. Remember, she was a Polish immigrant. She went to their house after going to the hospital, looked through the kitchen, refrigerator, and then went into the bathroom where she found the bottle of Tylenol and the receipt in the garbage from when Adam had bought them earlier that day. Helen took out and counted the pills and then returned them to the bottle after noticing that there were 6 capsules missing. So she quickly realized that something must have been wrong with them, and she took the pills to the hospital to be tested by a medical examiner. Unfortunately, because Helen didn't hold any kind of authority in that office, she just wasn't believed by the examiner, and she wasn't able to get any kind of investigation started into those Tylenol pills. So now this means that in the span of just 48 hours, 3 members of the Janis family had collapsed suddenly and unexpectedly, leaving their remaining family members heartbroken and confused, and leaving the authorities with a bizarre tragedy to get to the bottom of, before even more people fell victim to it. In the days that followed, 3 more unexplained deaths occurred in the Chicago area, and these victims included 27-year-old Mary Lynn Reiner from Winfield, who was a mother of 4 children, her youngest being a newborn. She had recently returned from delivering her 4th child and, feeling some post-birth discomfort, decided to take a Tylenol. Horribly, Mary collapsed in front of her 8-year-old daughter immediately after taking the painkiller. The next victim was 31-year-old Mary McFarland from Elmhurst, Illinois, who took a Tylenol at work after experiencing a headache and collapsed shortly after, not even 10 minutes after she had taken the capsules. By the end of the day, on September 29th, Mary Kellerman, Adam Janis, Stanley Janis, Mary McFarland, and Mary Lynn Reiner had all passed away. Terry Janis was still on life support in critical condition, and she would be taken off of life support just the very next day on September 30th. The final victim in this case was identified just a couple of days later by Jean Levengood, who was a flight attendant for United Airlines. She had just finished her last trip for the day and had returned to Chicago's O'Hare International Airport. Most nights she would go out for a drink with her best friend Paula Prince after they had finished work, and that day Paula had left a note in Jean's mailbox at the airport telling her that she had great news to share with her. At this point, the two had been friends for about 15 years, and they lived in the same high-rise in Chicago. So when Jean got home from work, she picked up the phone and called her friend, 35-year-old Paula, who was also working as a flight attendant, but Paula did not answer the phone. After 2 whole days went by, Jean still hadn't heard from her, and she was getting extremely worried. Paula had missed one of her flights, and she also hadn't picked up her paycheck from the airport yet, all of which was extremely strange for her. So Jean called Paula's sister Carol, and they decided to go into Paula's apartment together on October 1st of 1982. As soon as they opened the door, they could see the body of Paula lying on the floor, with her head sticking out into the hallway and the rest of her body in the bathroom. Initially, they thought that she must have been murdered, so they called the police immediately. Shockingly, the press actually got to the high-rise before the police even did, and we'll talk even more about the investigation soon, but by the time that Paula was discovered, the Tylenol deaths were causing panic all over the nation. Paula had picked up a bottle of Tylenol on her way home from O'Hare International Airport because she was starting to get a cold. Her body was found with an open bottle of Tylenol on the bathroom counter, of which she had only taken one capsule and must have collapsed nearly immediately. The police on the scene found a receipt for the Tylenol. She had bought it at a Walgreens on the night of September 29th, 2 days before she was found. This final discovery brought the victim toll to 7 people. So now that we have most of the terrible stuff out of the way, let's go into the investigation and how that all played out. Dr. Kim, who was the chief of critical care who had treated the Janus family members, was made aware that there was a possible connection between the Tylenol and the mysterious deaths in the area. He knew what the symptoms of acetaminophen looked like, and he knew that the deaths could not have been caused by it. However, he theorized that perhaps the capsules could have been contaminated by a deadly chemical. He took blood samples from Stanley and Terry Janus, and he sent them to a lab for overnight testing. Police started the investigation with the Janus family since their deaths were so similar and they all occurred within such a short time frame. As you may have noticed, the connection between Tylenol and all of the deaths was made very quickly, but in the end this actually only created more questions. And as the death toll grew, the only link that anyone could find was that each victim had taken extra-strength Tylenol before suddenly dying. Police soon realized that Chuck Kramer, who was the fire chief, and the nurse, Helen, may have been onto something when they were insisting that the Tylenol may have been the cause of these mysterious deaths. At the Arlington Heights Hospital, which is where the Janus family members had passed away, an investigator from the medical examiner's office heard about the possible Tylenol connection, and he contacted his boss, who was the chief medical examiner, immediately. The Tylenol bottles from the Kellerman and Janus homes were taken as evidence, and they were brought to the office of the Cook County Deputy Chief Medical Examiner, Dr. Edmund Donahue. Dr. Donahue knew that there were not many chemicals that could cause such quick deaths in humans, one of which was potassium cyanide, so he told the investigator who had contacted him to open those bottles and to do a quick test, which actually only consisted of smelling the contents of those Tylenol bottles. As he would later explain, potassium cyanide has a particular odor, almost like bitter almonds, which the investigator noted was present in both of those bottles. After that, the Tylenol bottles were sent to a toxicologist, and the blood test results that Dr. Kim had ordered had become available. The cyanide was present in incredible levels, and the blood tests from each victim revealed anywhere from 100 to 1,000 times the lethal dose had been ingested. The toxicologist discovered the same thing, so the investigation at this point was moving really quickly, and the cause of death for each victim had actually been determined by September 30th, which is even before the body of the final victim, Paula Prince, had been found. Potassium cyanide itself is an incredibly deadly substance, and it has actually been used in gas form for executions, but that was discontinued in the 1990s when it was determined to cause too much suffering. Potassium cyanide is a naturally occurring chemical found in many plants that interferes with the electron transport chain in the mitochondria of our cells. This essentially just makes it impossible for the body to generate ATP, or energy, from the oxygen that we consume, which means that depending on the level of exposure, it can cause death within minutes, since a person's central nervous and cardiovascular systems can completely shut down. And its dangers were fully apparent in the Tylenol murders, as 6 of the 7 victims died within mere hours. Not unsurprisingly, the string of deaths began a nationwide panic, and stores hurriedly removed Tylenol from their stock. People also became paranoid of an accidental poisoning, and consumers were flooding hospitals and overwhelming poison control hotlines. No one knew how many bottles had been poisoned, and no one knew when or where this killer would strike again. Chicago police only fueled this panic by going through city streets with loudspeakers, warning people about the potential dangers of Tylenol pills. Although they must have known that this was going to cause widespread fear, pre-internet, they didn't really have time to wait for the dangers to be printed in the news. Officials actually told consumers to flush any Tylenol bottles in their homes down the toilet as a precaution. For Johnson & Johnson, the manufacturer of Tylenol, these events were a complete disaster, and they had to spend millions of dollars recalling their pills across the nation. Some of these recalled bottles were destroyed, and some were sent off for testing. The poisonings had taken place in 2 different counties in Illinois, so a lot of law enforcement agencies needed to work together to try and solve the case, including federal agencies. President Reagan wanted the FBI involved, so they joined the local law enforcement, Illinois State Police, as well as 5 suburban police departments in creating the Tylenol Task Force. They set up a command post in a state police office, and the first meeting there was so crowded it was standing room only. Over 100 investigators came out to lend their expertise to the case. The problem here was that police didn't really have much to go off of, because the pills came from different production plants and were sold in different drugstores. While the 2 bottles from the Janice and Kellerman homes had been part of the same batch, they had been produced in completely different factories in 2 completely different states, Pennsylvania and Texas. In the end, the only similarity between these bottles of Tylenol was that they had both ended up on shelves in the Chicago area. So this quickly led investigators to the horrifying conclusion that someone was tampering with the bottles on the drugstore shelves rather than on the production line. The running theory is that the perpetrator went to several different stores where Tylenol was available and took several bottles. This person would then open each bottle, since at the time there was no tamper-proof seal, and remove some of the pills. These pills were designed as capsules so they could be opened, and the original contents was removed and replaced with cyanide. Police did make this discovery pretty quickly, and it was their working theory by October 1st. However, it was difficult to begin a further investigation since no fingerprints were recovered from any of the bottles. Police were able to find the stores where each of the bottles were purchased from, but there was no video camera footage available from any of those stores to try and find a suspect. 3 more bottles were found to have been tampered with and placed back on shelves, all 3 of them in the Chicago area. Thankfully, these were discovered before they were purchased by anyone, but since police had put the word out that people needed to get rid of Tylenol bottles, there's no way of knowing if those bottles were the only additional ones that had been tampered with. The task force started by looking into store employees, past employees, any customers who had been disgruntled in the stores in the past, and trying to find out if any of the victims had anything in common besides the poisoning. So essentially they were just interviewing anyone and everyone who they could find. They opened a tip line, which got 177 calls in the first day, and this was just the beginning of this massive investigation. Eventually they got to over 6,000 tips, and still no suspects. The way that the task force operated was they would share leads each morning and get their assignments for the day. Then once the day was over, they would meet back at the state police office that they had set up as their command center and debrief on any updates. Unfortunately, the Tylenol murders were not immune to copycat crimes, and hundreds of other similar crimes were reported, with the Food and Drug Association reporting over 270 different product tampering incidents in the months that followed the Chicago Tylenol deaths. These copycat cases started only within a week of Mary Kellerman's death, and on October 5th of 1982, a California man became sick when he took Tylenol that had been laced with strychnine? I honestly don't know. And 3 total bottles of poison pills were traced to a local drugstore. One of the more famous cases of this was Stella Nickel of Auburn, Washington, who poisoned her husband in 1986 by lacing Excedrin tablets with cyanide. She tried to cover this crime by putting more poisoned Excedrin on a store shelf, which actually led to the death of another person, a stranger to her, Susan Snow. Stella Nickel was caught, unlike the Chicago poisoner, and was charged in relation to both deaths. Some of these copycats ventured to food poisoning instead, and that Halloween people started to report finding sharp pins, needles, and razor blades concealed in their children's candy, a Halloween horror story that is still told to this day. Some towns at the time even banned trick-or-treating altogether. Police do still have some of the Tylenol capsules from the original killings, and so they remain hopeful that some DNA can be recovered from them for testing eventually. Before I start to talk through the multiple theories in connection with this case, since poisoning is a topic that I haven't really covered on this podcast, I would like to give some attention to the psychological profile of a poisoner since it is definitely relevant here. This is actually more common than we might like to think, and experts do believe that the number of convicted poisoners is just the start. In comparison to other crimes, what we don't know about poisoners may be 20 to 30 times higher, which is horrifying. Contrary to popular belief, the majority of convicted poisoners are actually men, and less surprisingly, these criminals are overrepresented in the medical field or in caretaking professions. What is really interesting, though, is that the vast majority of poisoners actually victimize someone that they know personally, which makes this case even more bizarre. It is thought that since poison is such an ideal weapon of choice, it tells us more about the intelligence of a perpetrator than about their actual personality. Poisoning requires careful planning, so poisoners tend to be cunning, sneaky, and creative. They also tend to avoid physical confrontation and rely on verbal and emotional manipulation instead, which is applicable whether the poisoner is a male or a female. They also tend to have a deep-rooted sense of inadequacy, compensating for this with a hatred of authority, a need for control, and a self-centered interpersonal style. They view other people without empathy and are not guided by morals. Interestingly, in regard to motives, poisoners generally don't differ from others who are involved in homicide cases, but there are always outliers and rarer motivations exist for criminal poisoning cases. This is far from a complete profile, and since a shocking 1 of 5 verified murders by poisoning are ever solved, a definitive profile is actually really hard to come by, but it does provide some insight as to who this person may have been personally, if they cannot be identified by name just yet. Before we get into some of the theories, I wanted to mention an interesting note about this case. Since criminal profiling was a relatively new science at the time, this case was actually one of the first times that Chicago PD had ever employed the tactic to try and solve a crime. From what they were able to come up with, they thought that this would have most likely been someone who had been treated for mental health issues, and that they would probably have violence in their history, particularly with animals. They also noted that this person would likely have been somebody who was no stranger to holding a grudge and was a seeker of revenge. And this profile does line up with the psychology which we just discussed, suggesting that the perpetrator here was likely someone who was capable of intense hatred and that there were likely some existing comorbidities present. So as I've said, no one was ever actually arrested for these murders. However, one theory did start to emerge in October of 1982, when a tax consultant named James Lewis wrote a letter to Tylenol's manufacturer, Johnson & Johnson, demanding $1 million to, quote, stop the killings, wired to a bank account also included in this letter. This was a one-page handwritten letter that was sent to an office in Pennsylvania. It was written in all capital letters, tilting slightly to the right, and the letter was unsigned. Weirdly enough, the letter actually seemed to be a cross between extortion and confession. However, to add another layer of strangeness to it, the letter mentioned it being easy to put both potassium and sodium cyanide into the pills, but as you'll remember, the only chemical actually used in the killings was potassium cyanide, so this may have just been a copycat trying to cover all their bases. Luckily, Johnson & Johnson decided to immediately turn this letter into law enforcement, and there were some clues within it. Firstly, the bank account number was able to be traced to a business in Chicago called Lakeside Travel. This was a travel agency that booked flights and rental cars pre-internet. The owner of Lakeside Travel was a man named Frederick Miller McCahey. He was actually the heir to the Miller brewing fortune. So when police sat down with him, they found out that the travel agency had closed earlier in 1982, and that bank account had subsequently also been closed. They very quickly were able to determine that McCahey had no motive, and based on his cooperation, he was really just ruled out. So they started to look into anyone who had worked for Lakeside Travel, employees who would have had access to the bank account number, and who also would have had access to the postage on the envelope, which the task force had determined had also originated from Lakeside Travel. They found information about a husband and wife named Robert and Nancy Richardson who had been involved in a financial dispute with Lakeside Travel when the business closed. It was discovered that Nancy had stolen postage stamps from the business along with other miscellaneous items, so they became the first real persons of interest who were involved in the writing of the extortion letter. So here is where it gets a little bit tricky. Robert and Nancy Richardson were both aliases, and their true identities were James William Lewis and his wife Leanne from Missouri. Lewis was able to be identified when a police officer from Kansas City, Missouri recognized him from a previous encounter and turned him into police on October 13th of 1982. Lewis was interrogated several times, but he maintained his innocence fervently. A look into his past, however, revealed some major red flags, in particular a case from July 1978 in Kansas City when Raymond West, a man in his early 70s, went missing. At the time, Raymond West was retired and he had $40,000 to $50,000 in savings. He was known for helping his neighbors around their houses and just generally being a good Samaritan. After not hearing from Raymond after a few days in July of 1978, people started to get really worried, so a friend drove to his house to check, and it seemed like no one was there, so the police were called. James Lewis was actually an accountant for Raymond West, and so he was immediately on the radar of the police. When they contacted him, Lewis claimed that Raymond had gone away with his girlfriend, even though he was single at the time, so this did nothing to ease the concerns of Raymond's friends. Police actually ended up forcing their way into Raymond's home, but they didn't find anything by way of evidence. But on the second search, they were much more thorough, and they conducted the second search after some odd behavior by James Lewis had been reported. During the second search, police discovered the body of Raymond West in his own attic. The cause of death for Raymond West was never officially determined, but his body had been dismembered and laid face down in the attic of his home. The scene suggested, however, that the murder had been very disorganized and not well thought out. Luckily, there had been a lot of evidence left behind at Raymond's home, and James Lewis was the first person to be questioned after his body was found. Police noticed at the time that he seemed to actually enjoy the process of being questioned, treating it almost like a game, and he kept talking despite the advice of his attorney. In Lewis's possession, the police did find evidence of items that had been stolen from Raymond, as well as rope that matched the one discovered with Raymond's body, so the police knew that they likely had the right guy, and James Lewis was arrested for murder, with the trial set to start in 1979. Unfortunately, this case was far from simple, and because the coroner couldn't determine any cause of death, Lewis was able to argue that Raymond West could have died from natural causes days before his body was dismembered. There was a major problem with the prosecution's case, however. During Lewis's first interview with the police, they never informed him of his right to remain silent or of his right to speak with an attorney, so anything from that point on in the investigation was considered inadmissible. This did include all of the evidence that had been found in Lewis's car and all of the testing that had been done on the evidence from Raymond's house, so the district attorney had no choice but to throw out the case, and Lewis was free to go. And now I honestly have no idea if I think James Lewis committed the Tylenol murders, but if he did, this is just so heartbreaking that he was in the grasp of the police and they could have prevented it from happening, and one mistake in the investigation and all of it was just let go. In 1981, he had his home searched in Kansas City in relation to a credit card scam that he was running. Lewis would later claim that he was innocent of fraud, but in the end it was found that he scammed people out of over $17,000 in total, so already we have a repeat offender. Police did get an arrest warrant, but when they returned to the house, he and his wife were gone. This was until he was discovered for sending the extortion letter in 1982. When the task force convened in 1982, they were able to come up with 12 different aliases that James Lewis had previously used, as well as a piece of evidence from the Raymond West case, a fingerprint that was lifted from West's home, and when FBI examined this fingerprint, they found it to be a match to the extortion letter. Obviously, this can't conclusively prove that Lewis was West's killer, but it definitely adds a lot more credibility to the theory. And I know that he was never really given a proper investigation or a proper trial, but I don't really have any qualms about saying that I think he murdered Raymond West. It also demonstrated to the Tylenol task force that Lewis was someone who was capable of not only fraud, but also of violence. So now knowing that he wrote the letter, they could start looking at him under a new lens and investigate whether he could also be the Tylenol murderer. From there, the task force was able to uncover more information about Lewis's activities after he had sent the original extortion letter, finding out that he also sent a letter to the White House threatening that he would place more cyanide in stores across the country if the president signed off on a tax increase. This letter was signed Fred M. in an attempt to pretend he was the owner of Lakeside Travel, Fred McCahey, who he had tried to frame for sending the first letter. He also sent a letter to the Chicago Tribune, which also attempted to implicate Fred McCahey. Seemingly, he had quite the vendetta against him, which we'll go back to discussing the intense hatred of authority figures, and not to mention the ability to hold a grudge that we had talked about while discussing the psychology of poisoners. And even beyond this, Lewis seemed to really be enjoying the attention and enjoying the fact that he was kind of sending the task force on a search. FBI notes on Lewis indicated that appearing macho was very important to him, and that was something he even tried to emulate through his physical appearance. Lewis started writing more letters to the Chicago Tribune, all postmarked from New York City, so the task force put out the word to people who worked at the New York Public Library that he was probably getting copies of the Tribune there since it wasn't generally available outside of the city of Chicago. On December 13th of 1982, a librarian reported that he was at the library taking notes, and he was swiftly taken into custody by the FBI. Once he was arrested, James Lewis's bond was set at $5 million, which is really high for an extortion letter, and especially then, but it was so high because the letter was linked to the 7 mysterious deaths. He had previously admitted to purchasing cyanide, and he had also been found to have owned a book on poisoning, where his fingerprints were lifted from page 196, which, you guessed it, this was the page that detailed the lethal dose of potassium cyanide. So that doesn't look great. But the Lewises had actually left Chicago for New York nearly a month before the killings, so the investigators needed to somehow show that he had traveled back to Chicago under an alias, which was likely unknown, if they were to show that he was involved in the poisoning itself. Though his work at the travel agency would have made this possible if he was using an unknown alias and had previously purchased a train ticket under that name. The task force was never able to find anything that could prove that Lewis had gone back to Chicago, which made it nearly impossible to get an indictment, and some investigators do feel that this was the only missing piece to the investigation. And the Chicago police superintendent at the time, who was named Richard Burzak, said that it was likely he would never be prosecuted in connection to them, but he was convicted of attempted extortion for sending that letter to Johnson & Johnson, and for this he was sent to federal prison and was paroled in the year 1995. During his stint in prison, he wrote letters to investigators about his thoughts on the case, and one letter in particular described the process of injecting cyanide into Tylenol capsules, which is weird, but remember he was also kind of playing games with investigators, and he seemed to really be enjoying the process of being investigated for some unknown reason, so maybe it's not all that weird. In 2004, 9 years after he was released from prison, Lewis was charged with a number of offenses after allegedly attacking a woman in Cambridge, Massachusetts. For this, he spent 3 years in jail while awaiting trial, but the charges again were ultimately dismissed when the victim decided not to testify. The Tylenol murders investigation was renewed in the 2000s, resulting in the search of Lewis's condo, where a computer and several other items were seized in the hopes that forensic science advancements would make a difference in a review of all the evidence, but unfortunately it did not come to anything. James Lewis passed away in July of 2023 and still has never directly been charged with anything in connection to the Tylenol murders. Now, this second theory isn't really based on any evidence at all, but it's definitely still worth mentioning since it's brought up in a lot of sources. This one is that Ted Kaczynski, widely known as the Unabomber, was the culprit. The main connection between Ted Kaczynski and the Tylenol murders was that his bombings, as well as these poisonings, were both considered to be acts of domestic terrorism. In his manifesto, Kaczynski writes of technology giants taking over people's lives and poisoning the environment, and technology giants could definitely apply to pharmaceutical companies like Johnson & Johnson. He was also considered as a suspect since his initial bombings were targeted in an area around Chicago at Northwestern University, a passenger plane from Chicago to Washington, D.C., and the president of United Airways who lived in Lake Forest, Illinois. His parents also lived in Lombard, Illinois, which was a Chicago suburb he would visit occasionally. DNA samples were taken from Kaczynski in 2011, but nothing has ever been found to link him with the Tylenol murders, and he has always denied ever even owning cyanide. In connection with his bombings, however, he was sentenced to 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the deaths of 3 and injury caused to many others. So even if he did do it on the very, very off chance, he was taken off the streets. So that's at least a good thing. The third theory in this case is that the culprit was a man named Roger Arnold, who worked at a distribution center for Jewel supermarkets where Tylenol was regularly sold. However, it is worth noting that he worked in the warehouse, not in the stores, so he was unloading and loading trucks, not working directly with the merchandise on the shelves. But weirdly enough, he actually worked with Mary Reiner's father at this warehouse, and they actually occasionally ate lunch together, so there is a connection there between him and one of the victims. His name only came into the picture when he was reported for strange behavior after the murders, talking about a recent purchase of cyanide that he had made while he was at a bar one night. Someone at the bar reported this to police, and he was taken into custody for questioning. The police were able to find out that Arnold had recently gotten a divorce, and he had lost his home to his wife in the proceedings, which had caused him to really fall into a depression at the time. Police said that he struck them as being quite resentful of his position in life, which is interesting because it could definitely cause somebody to lash out. Additionally, he had been visiting his wife at a psychiatric facility right across the street from where Mary Reiner bought her Tylenol pills, so there is yet another connection to Mary Reiner. Now, Arnold insisted that he had gotten rid of the cyanide that he had purchased before the murders took place, but since circumstantial evidence had really started to stack up against him, police were able to conduct a thorough search of his house, where they found all types of lab equipment, and a book that they found had a section dedicated to making potassium cyanide, as well as 5 firearms that he owned illegally in the house. They also found an airline ticket to Thailand, which was leaving on October 15th of that same year. One of the investigators who was involved in the search of Arnold's home after the search never had a doubt in his mind that Arnold was the Tylenol murderer, but at the time there really wasn't any physical evidence. In order to keep him in custody, police charged Arnold with failing to register the firearms in his home and with assault. Apparently, he had recently pulled a gun on somebody during a bar fight. His bond hearing was on October 13th, and he was released pending those charges. After being released, Arnold made a lot of statements concerning how he was being treated by the media, saying that he was being portrayed as a psychopath, and as a result, he had become terrified that somebody would kill him in an act of vigilante justice. All of this really started to build up inside him, and he began directing all of this hatred towards the person who had originally called in that tip about him to the police. While reading police records about his gun charges, he was actually able to find the name of the person who reported him, and this man was Marty Sinclair. Marty Sinclair was a pub owner on Lincoln Avenue, and as time went on after the murders, Arnold's resentment towards Sinclair really started to grow. So in mid-June of 1983, Arnold went to a bar on Lincoln Avenue called Lily's, and he recognized a man who he identified as Marty Sinclair, who happened to be at the bar on the same night. Arnold left the bar and came back around closing time, and he would later report seeing this man leaving the bar with a couple of friends. Arnold later recalled walking towards this man outside of the bar and saying, quote, "Marty, did you turn me in?" and then firing off a shot. Arnold then walked back to his car, drove to the Chicago River, disposed of the gun, and drove into Indiana. He got to a hotel, called his lawyer from the hotel, and turned himself in the next day. Horrifyingly, not only had Arnold committed a senseless act of violence, but the man who he had killed was not Marty Sinclair. Instead, he was a man named John Stanishaw, who had a 16-year-old daughter at the time of the shooting. For this, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison in January of 1984 and was paroled after 15 years, passing away himself in 2008. That same year, in 2008, he started to have horrific nightmares about John Stanishaw. So now not only do we have circumstantial evidence connecting 2 different suspects to the Tylenol murders, but both of them have proven themselves to be fully capable of committing super violent acts just like this. Task Force detectives found out that after he was sentenced, Arnold had filed an appeal, and they thought that they might be able to use this as leverage to try and get him to talk about the Tylenol murders, but the state's attorney didn't want to cooperate since this might intervene with the FBI's case against Lewis. At the time, there was actually a lot of tension between Chicago PD and the FBI, and this essentially ended the investigation into Arnold, much to the chagrin of Chicago investigators, who thought that the FBI had tunnel vision towards Lewis and that they didn't want CPD to have solved the case. Since then, the FBI has denied all claims that they didn't investigate all avenues of the Tylenol murders, but it probably would have been nice to try and question Arnold again after the arrest. I don't know, that's just me. Other theories have garnered much less attention, but they are still worth mentioning here. Criminal profilers have suggested that this poisoner has never been discovered because they either committed suicide or passed away from other causes after the killings. Others have suggested domestic terrorist groups, however, experts discounted this almost immediately, citing the fact that terrorist groups generally claim their crimes and no demands were ever made. The last theory actually was put forth by a woman named Michelle Rosen, who was the daughter of one of the victims, Mary Reiner. She said that she doesn't believe the killer was a lone madman, and her theory is that the tampering actually did take place at the manufacturing plant before the bottles were ever shipped. She created her own website dedicated to the investigation, which features a blurb about a book on the subject, The Tylenol Mafia. According to the website, the Tylenol Mafia unearths the troubling details of an investigation corrupted by well-connected corporate executives and politically motivated government officials who simply buried the truth inside a shadow legal system inaccessible to everyday Americans. I will say this theory seems really far-fetched to me, and while I am incredibly sympathetic to the loss of her mother, I really don't think that Michelle's theory is going to gain too much more traction. As I'm sure you can assume from a case of this nature, its impact was massive, and it spurred a positive change in product safety standards industry-wide. Pharmaceutical and food companies drastically improved their packaging, started using tamper-proof seals and indicators, and increased security measures during the manufacturing process as well. Johnson & Johnson themselves have been praised for the handling of the disaster in its wake. They quickly recalled over 31 million bottles in total, with a retail value of over $100 million, as well as announcing to customers that if they disposed of bottles already purchased, they would be refunded. Hospitals also disposed of any Tylenol on hand, and the company even offered a $100,000 reward for information that led to the arrest of the perpetrator. Johnson & Johnson also switched from the capsule design of their pills to caplets, and other companies started to follow this example soon afterwards. In total, 1.5 million bottles were tested, and 10 of them contained poison capsules. This number would range from 3 to 4 per bottle, to some that had 6 or more. However, it is noted that the bottles that got thrown away were never tested, so the actual number of poison pills can never truly be known. And the sort of grim upside here is that this actually proved really successful in reducing the number of copycat criminals, though the fates of the original 7 victims of the Tylenol murders obviously can never be changed. Congress made its own response to the killings and passed the Tylenol bill, which officially made tampering with consumer products a federal crime, and the Food and Drug Administration made the tamper-proof packaging for all similar products an official federal guideline, though the precedent had clearly already been set. Any case where there is no clear motive is one that I consider to be fascinating as well as disturbing, and this is definitely one that sticks out among the bunch. To this day, most people consider these killings to be the act of one lone madman, however, who exactly is the ever-important and still unanswered question. Personally, I do believe that this was a crime committed by someone who was acting alone, and James Lewis does seem like the most likely suspect, but I'm not 100% convinced that he's guilty, and I think that Arnold might be just as good of a suspect if he's not edging out James Lewis a little bit in my head right now. While we may never receive a full conclusion to the Tylenol murders, at the very least we can rest assured that its perpetrator and its copycats have been heavily impeded by the new safety regulations that have since been put into place. It does leave us with an interesting reminder, however, and a daily look into one of this country's most notorious unsolved crimes to date. With that being said, thank you for listening to the very brand new episode of the Crime Bistro podcast. And if you are interested in learning more about the 1982 Chicago Tylenol murders, all of the sources are going to be listed in the show notes at crimebistro.com or on my YouTube page. If you have a theory or a comment of your own to share, feel free to head over and visit the podcast on YouTube or on Instagram to leave a comment and to see some behind-the-scenes updates on the really exciting episodes to come. With that being said, this story is coming to a close, so thank you again, and as always, until next time.